All right, welcome back. We've been looking forward to this segment of the Kincaid and Breakenridge show for some time now. We do like discussing Calgary Next, and when Calgary Next came into the news, it was very, let me say a couple things about it, optimistic plan, but it was also somewhat controversial in terms of how we're going to get Calgary Next across the board here. So it's been out there now. The president and CEO of the Calgary Flames, Ken King, joins us in studio. Ken, welcome to the program.
Gentlemen, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
You know, before we got to the announcement, I mean, there had been speculation for a long time that, you know, well, the Flames are going to come out with something. When are we going to get this? I know we talked to you back in the spring during the playoff run, and, you know, you'd indicated that something was close, and then it kind of got quiet for a while. Talk about why it took so long to unveil this in the first place.
Fair question. We have been working, the first drawings I saw were in 2007. We knew at some point we were going to do it. Those were early days, and we looked at a vast number of options. We worked, for example, just as a sidelight, we worked with the convention center for a year to determine whether or not there was a fit between a new convention center and us, and ultimately determined that that was not the case. Actually, they determined that more than we did, and looked at other sites and other places. As this began to kind of come together, the pieces of it came together when we looked at the RFP for the field house and studied that over some time, and then looked at McMahon. Remembering in the beginning, we weren't talking about a multi-use project here. We were just talking about an event center to start with, and then it has kind of grown from there. So that was really part of the time. And we didn't have a deadline particularly. I began to get a little embarrassed because, of course, people kept asking about it, and I kept kind of pushing it back, and I felt bad about that. But, you know, you need to introduce these things at appropriate times.
Okay. Ken, explain to us why the Flames need a new facility to play hockey in.
Well, the Saddledome, when we are complete with this new project, the Saddledome, Scotiabank Saddledome, will be coming up on 40 years old, give or take, depending on how long it takes to do this. That is not unusual in terms of a lifespan. The new era of buildings, if you look at the real new era of buildings now, if you look at Detroit and New Jersey and the Barclays Center and Edmonton, of course, and others, is now. There is a sort of a 2012, 2015, 16 kind of era. The other era was in the mid-90s. All of the buildings that are currently in existence in North America were built somewhere between 93, 94, 95, 96, and then more laterally. Those buildings, including the United Center in Chicago, for example, are now slated for change or renovation or those other things. And, of course, we significantly predate that. So if we're going to remain in our city, if we're going to have a gathering place, and it's 1.8 million people go through that building, that's going to be vital, and it's going to be able to draw the kinds of things that we need to draw and to keep us on a vital and current basis, then at some point you need to do it, and now's the time.
At what point did you rule out then replacing the Saddledome where the Saddledome is, building a new arena on the Stampede ground?
That, Rob, took place when we ultimately determined we had a more ambitious project. When it got to the point that the field house became integrated in it, and we've always looked at McMahon Stadium and said, what are we going to do there? I mean, a lot of people said to us, well, you're looking at Scotiabank Saddledome, but how come you're not looking at McMahon Stadium? So when it grew to the proportions that frankly simply wouldn't fit on that site in its current configuration, that's when we started to look at other places. And we looked at all the suburban locations, which have been catastrophic for those cities and those organizations that have gone to suburbia. This needs to be an urban building and an urban project.
By the way, what becomes now of McMahon and the Saddledome?
Well, I think McMahon is easier. I think that's what we call a TOD opportunity, transit-oriented development opportunity. It's a beautiful piece of property, and it belongs to the University of Calgary, and I think would represent a huge opportunity for them either financially or in terms of their expansion opportunities. They're doing West Campus, of course, so. But that's really their determination. But I think it would be removed, and if the follow-up, of course, is Scotiabank Saddledome, we, as you know, we put forward a notion, an idea simply of an undemised floor in the middle for exhibit and trade space. But that was an idea. That we weren't proposing that as a particularly vital concept. We need to sit down and figure out what that building can be used for.
We're talking to Ken King, President and CEO of the Calgary Flames with the Calgary Next project. Ken, Can you describe how staying in the Saddle Dome, if this Calgary Next project didn't see the light of day, how staying in the Saddle Dome would affect the profitability of the hockey club and the entire operation?
I'm not sure profitability is the right benchmark for it. I mean, you have to have a viable business, that's for sure. But increasingly, and for some time now, I don't think anyone would argue. You guys have been down there. It's chopped up. That renovation in '94 served some purposes, but frankly, it also I'm not so sure it was a perfect way to deal with it. And maybe there aren't perfect ways. Just like our new project, Calgary Next, isn't perfect, but it's just its functionality, its code requirements. I don't care if it's washrooms or the roof span and whether or not Taylor Swift or Madonna or anybody else can come there, all of which individually are not probably deal breakers. But when you put them in aggregate and accumulate them, it's just a building that needs to be replaced. It's past its time.
In terms of the West Village, there's obviously the land contamination issue. This proposal, it proceeds on an assumption that that's going to be addressed, but we still haven't figured that part out.
It's interesting, we saw the creosote as the opportunity. And actually, when I first chatted with the mayor's office, his eyes lit up. He said, "Whoa, wow, yeah," because it has to be dealt with. It was a very quiet subject. I don't think anybody was keeping it a secret, but people now know much more about creosote than they ever maybe even wanted to. But we saw that as an integral offshoot, a real benefit that we could take economically sterile land and turn it into something really valuable. So it didn't dissuade us. It actually attracted us. So what happens now? Calgary Municipal Land Corporation will look at it. They'll make an assessment of it with their consultants, whom they have hired. I think it's going to take 2 or 3 months. They'll make an evaluation of how to clean it up, what way, how much, and everything else, and then we'll take the next step.
Is it fair that if we look at the total cost of this project to include those costs in that total?
Is it? Sure. It's not in our $890 million. And we made that clear at the outset that the creosote cleanup, which we believe, if you look at the research, and I'm sure that you both have, there's a real liability issue here that is fundamentally owned by the province. They have indemnified the city for liability up until and if the city touches that soil. So the city's never touching that soil under those circumstances. We know that. If I were running the city, I wouldn't touch that soil under those circumstances. But that means then that unless we have a more creative solution where the polluter pays, or perhaps different levels of government could get together and not point fingers and not talk about liability, but say, hey, are we going to leave this toxic site the way it is, or are we going to get together and figure out how we can clean it up? But the point is the cost of it is outside of that. And whether we do this project or not, that cost will remain, and it'll be dealt with at some point. I think we all know that.
Well, but we wonder if it will be dealt with. We also wonder who will be the one to deal with it. I don't think the province can really find, if it's $100 million, just as an example, because estimates have ranged between 50 and 300. But if it's $100 million, and then we add it to the total cost of the Calgary Next project, which brings it to nearly $1 billion, what portion of the creosote cleanup then does the hockey team do you take on?
I don't think. Let's reverse field a little bit. Let's say that we came and we said, "Hey, we like this site. If you could deliver that site to us cleanly, we can come up with $450 million in terms of a private-public partnership. Are you interested in that?" Mm-hmm. Well, for sure they're interested in cleaning it up. Listen, whatever it costs, it's going to get cleaned up. This city is not going to take a key and critical central part of its downtown and leave it lie fallow for the next 30 years as it has for the last 30 years. And this problem is this current government, as a matter of fact, while they have stated quite clearly they're a polluter pay, and we all are, you understand, we couldn't go open a gas station here and walk away, change our address, and not have liability for that. So it's going to be cleaned up. This government may have a greater propensity for doing that than the previous government. I don't know if that's true or not, but they seem to be more sensitive to those kinds of things. So it's coming, it's going to happen, and my guess is it'll be very interesting to see where the polluter comes out in the process here.
Regardless, so the city would still own the land, and as I understand, the city would own the facilities, or the facility singular. But explain, though, in terms then of the revenue, if you can. Obviously, Flames games, Stampeders games, that's revenue for the teams, but concession parking at those events, and then non-Flames and non-Stampeders events, would the Flames still profit from everything else?
Because it's a multi-use facility. So right now we pay rent. We operate and benefit from the Scotiabank Saddledome and are responsible for it. That flood of 2013, we didn't run away and say, hey, somebody better come fix our building here. We looked after the city's property and the city's building. We did it expediently. We did it quite, I think, brilliantly, and at no cost to anyone else. That's what you do when you're a tenant in our circumstances. So we sit down, we negotiate what the tenancy looks like in that new building. Right now, we pay probably the highest level of rent in the CFL to the oldest stadium, and we have no. I mean, McMahon Stadium Society are wonderful people. They've maintained that old stadium pretty well, so those are negotiated positions, and how much private money goes in has a factor with that. If you look at the Edmonton's model is kind of reversed. They have a 35-year rent agreement and very little upfront money.
Right.
Now it's still money whether you put it up front or you put it behind. Or over the term of it. So those are the things that you negotiate once you get past the rhetoric.
So we don't know at this point.
No, I think it's not fair to say we don't. Okay. No, we have a preferred position. The city doesn't have a preferred position because they didn't lay awake all night praying that we were going to come in with this project. Okay, we came in. It represents an opportunity. I'm grateful beyond measure that both the mayor and the councillors have all looked at it that way and said, we weren't thinking about this, but this could be a splendid opportunity for our city. So let's find that out. Let's find out if it can work or not.
Okay. We're going to take a short pause here, Ken, if you don't mind standing by.
I'm talking about Calgary Next. And look, I mean, regardless of where people stand on this, I mean, we need to be having this conversation. Now, I'd written about this week in the Herald, and I know you picked up on something in there. It was a comment you made last week about people who might be against this project, for example, as haters, you had said.
You know what? I said to Peter, actually, and another colleague, as I walked away, we came out of that meeting. You also commented that I was the only one that had commented out of that meeting. I had taken great pains to separate the questions on that from that meeting because we had agreed we weren't talking about that meeting and didn't. But I did use that phrase, and this isn't your normal political mea culpa here. As soon as I said it, I said, that's not really what I mean. What I mean is that there are people who don't like things. Sometimes they don't like them for really valid and thoughtful reasons. Sometimes they just don't like them because, well, they're tall people or they're rich people or whatever the case might be. And I used the term haters, which immediately, and you caught it perfectly in your column, immediately said, well, hold it. Just because I don't like what you want, why am I a treacherous hater? And that was just an extraordinarily poor choice of words. When you're communicating a message this complicated, you're going to hopefully do a good job of it. But one of the other ones, two of the other issues were traffic and parking. When I made our original presentation, somebody had talked about traffic and parking. I kind of brushed it off and said, well, we have the LRT, we have pedestrian, we have downtown parking, that type of thing, which implied that perhaps we weren't going to have enough parking or transportation. Well, there's no benefit to us. You need great transportation. You need great parking there. It would be a far, far greater problem for us than it would for anybody else. We can't build something that people can't get to and they can't be at. So that was on me. That was my bad. The other one was the user fee. I called it a ticket tax, is what it is. But the fact of the matter is that those that wish to characterize this from a tax standpoint versus a private standpoint said, well, that's tax. It's user pay. It's $250 million. The owner equity is $200 million. That's $450 million of private sector funds in here. It's not $200 of private sector and $250 of tax.
Okay, but the question
it's $450.
But the question about that ticket tax or that user fee is who fronts that money?
Well, and that is a perfect question. So in Edmonton, for example, the city fronted that money. But lest anyone be trepidatious about well, that's taxpayers' money. It's a term loan. It's a loan. It has an interest rate. It has to be paid back. So to the extent that the city or the province had borrowing capacity, who cares where it comes from? As long as it's paid back and as long as it accrues an interest rate. So that and let's assume for some reason that there's no borrowing capacity, then you go to on a commercial basis.
Sure.
It's not complicated.
Okay.
But the key is
But why not
that
just
it's not a gift.
Right. But why not just start at the commercial basis? Because I think that there are people who may not be so sophisticated in the context of the conversation you're talking about and saying, well, we do have to assume some risk. If we're putting up $250 million, it's the city taxpayers or the provincial taxpayers that are assuming the risk if for some reason the Calgary Flames can't pay back the loan on the term.
Then that risk is mitigated through securitization. Now,
Okay.
if you make a dumb loan and somebody defaults on it and you don't have any security on it, then that's just not very smart business. If I were making that loan, I know what I'd look at for security.
Right.
And if you were making a loan, the same thing. So it's not a pat in the back kind of a thing. You don't give anybody $250 million on a loan basis without tight, solid security.
Okay, but you've also said that number is not a starting point, that you came up with this model based on a certain set of criteria. Obviously, you reached that number, the 200 million, the 250 million, et cetera. So how did you reach those numbers? How did you come up with this model?
It's based on what you can handle. If you consider debt loads, including that debt, and remember a user fee, let's call it $8 on 100 for the sake of conversation. So whether it's the first $8 or the last $8, you who are buying a ticket don't really care. You're paying $108 for the ticket. The market determines how much you can charge for tickets. We don't have an elastic model here that says, well, gee, you know what? We run our pro formas on this, and we need another 5,000 seats. And then if we have another 5,000 seats, we can pay the debt and we can do that. We have a finite inventory here, finite number of seats, finite number of events, although that hopefully there'll be more events in a new building than there will be in an old building, and they won't go to Edmonton. So the model has to sustain itself. Somebody comes along and says, well, let's build a $1.3 billion facility. Well, it can't sustain itself. It has to be a sustainable business model that works just like any other business model, and it has to also work from a city's perspective too. Take a look at the CRL. So the other mistake, not our mistake, but is, well, we're saying $240 million in CRL. That's not all of the CRL. Okay, the CRL will be much greater than that. To be determined. Again, nobody's writing a check for $240 million and say, gee, I hope somebody builds a hotel, or I hope somebody builds a Beau office tower or a condo or something like that. You've got to have commitments to do those things. The efficacy of that CRL has to be proven. CMLC are the best people at that. They did it in East Village. Mm-hmm. Now, if it has a range of 500 million to 700 million, that might become speculative. But the fact of the matter is you have to prove these things out, and we get that. I want to go to hotel companies and office people and say, hey, look what we're building here. Can we entice you? Can we get you interested in doing something here? The city needs to do that. I think if this project is as positive influence on the area and our city as we think it is, it'll attract investment, and that's part of the case, right?
Do you think it can attract more investment, though, than several other stakeholders coming to the table and developing a West Village similar to what we see on the east side of the city now?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Because I think East Village is spectacular, and CMLC, I think, deserves credit, as do the political thinkers in terms of that plan for there. So I think it's good. If we were in East Village, I think it would help East Village. There's no room for us in East Village, so we're not. So if it's not us in West Village, I would put this question to you or your listeners, then what would be better? What would attract more people? What would get more people to want to live there, to play there, and to work there? If there's a better idea than ours, we haven't seen it or heard it for 30 years.
Let me throw two quick questions that can be answered with short answers, I think. When will we see more detailed renderings of this? And I'm also curious, as is the case in Edmonton, would this agreement include a relocation clause?
Again, that's a to be determined question. But if I were on the other side, I'd include a relocation clause. I'm not going to negotiate for the other side, but those are all norms. We've never talked about relocation issues, and you're never going to get it out of my mouth. The fact of the matter is that if you believe that the Calgary Flames and the Calgary Stampeders and the Roughnecks and the Western Hockey League Hitmen and Shania Twain tonight and tomorrow night and all of the other cultural events and We Day and the Junos and everything else are important and valuable to our city, then we should do this, and the West Village is the best place to do it. Somebody said, no, I have a better idea. Forget about that. Then they should bring that idea forward.
Right. Well, Ken King, thanks so much for coming in with us.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I think what's really important is that we get a chance to answer hard questions, as that you have asked, and Rob, that you've written about, that are very reasonable. And the more opportunity we have to discuss it, I think the better people will understand it.
Ken, this is going to be a big process for the city, so the door's open anytime, okay?
Thanks so much.
We would love to have you back on.
I appreciate it.
All right, Ken King, President and CEO of Calgary Sports and Entertainment Corporation, the Calgary Flames. We'll be back after the news to 10:30.
Roger Kincaid and Rob Breckenridge.